To really get to the bottom of this, we must discuss events leading up to the Holocaust and how much of these the German people and wider world knew about. To begin with, when Hitler and his cohorts first came to power in 1933, some of the first things that they did were to suspend the civil liberties of the German people, such as now allowing imprisonment of citizens without trial. It's always a good sign that you've chosen your leaders well. More pertinent to the topic at hand, doubling down on the ominous tone of the new regime, within a few months the Nazis had established their first concentration camp in Dachau. The main purpose of this new facility was to hold political dissidents, among other undesirables. You see, the existing prison systems were deemed insufficient to be able to house the number that needed to be rounded up. Not mincing words about how prisoners would be treated there, SS official Johann Erasmus Freiherr von Mausen-Ponickau gave this speech to members of the SS at Dachau shortly after it opened. You all know what the Führer has called us to do. We have not come here for human encounters with those pigs in there. We do not consider them human beings as we are, but as second-class people. For years, they have been able to continue their criminal existence. But now we are in power. If those pigs had come to power, they would have cut off all of our heads. Therefore, we have no room for sentimentalism. If anyone here cannot bear to see the blood of comrades, he does not belong and had better leave. The more of these pig dogs we strike down, the fewer we need to feed. Not long after this, a rather bloody purge, the Night of the Long Knives, occurred, and in the aftermath, Hitler not only was declared Führer, but also justified the murders, noting that it was done to protect Germany, publicly stating, "If anyone reproaches me and asks why I did not resort to the regular courts of justice, then all I can say is this. In this hour, I was responsible for the fate of the German people, and thereby I became the supreme judge of the German people. I gave the order to shoot the ringleaders in this treason, and I further gave the order to cauterize down to the raw flesh the ulcers of this poisoning of the wells in our domestic life. Let the nation know that its existence, which depends on its internal order and security, cannot be threatened with impunity by anyone. And let it be known for all time to come that if anyone raises his hand to strike the state, then certain death is his lot." Noteworthy here was that no real evidence was presented that any of these people had actually been planning a coup or anything of the sort. Hitler simply publicly stated they were, and as a result, he had them killed without trial. Going back to the concentration camps and the roundup of dissidents, while some of the atrocities being committed there were mostly kept under wraps in the media, the government were none too shy about broadcasting the roundups and existence of these facilities in the media precisely to help make anyone afraid to step out of line. It would also seem the Nazis had a policy to make sure they rounded up, at minimum, a sample from every community. This, combined with those released in the early going went back to their communities and discussed things that happened there, all seem to have done a bang-up job of instilling fear in the populace as intended. In fact, there were even little jingles about these places, such as this one from 1935 translated. "Dear God, make me dumb," as in silent, "that I may not to Dachau come." As Captain America's Dr. Abraham Erskine so sagely put, so many people forget that the first country that the Nazis invaded was their own. Or as one real-life contemporary German would state when interviewed, "You Americans can hardly understand the conditions under which we were living. It was as if all of Germany were a concentration camp and we were occupied by a foreign power. We were unable to do anything to oppose them. What could one person do against that powerful organization?" That said, though the Nazis did have an iron grip on the country at this point thanks to the coup and general support of the military, among others, they still needed some semblance of public support. And thus, simultaneous to all of this, the propaganda machine began doing its thing to help sway people to the side of Nazi ideology through various methods, including, of course, vilifying various groups, like most famously Jewish people, while also beginning to sow the seeds for the need for war. In particular, attempting to paint the picture that it would not be the Germans who were the aggressors in such a war, but that they were simply defending themselves. At the same time, laws to encourage the Jewish population of the nation to leave were also instituted, such as on April 1st, 1933, where there was a boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. Further, April 7th of 1933 expelled all non-Aryans from civil service, and there were laws against allowing Jewish lawyers, jurors, judges, etc. On April 25th, 1933, they restricted Jewish enrollment in German high schools to 1.5%, and perhaps most famously, in 1935, the Nuremberg laws became a thing. The list goes on, and all of this, everybody was well aware of. On top of this, the night of the broken glass and the aftermath was widely reported on in Germany and beyond. This occurred on the night of November 9th, 1938, and into the morning of the next day. On this one, in a nutshell, the Nazis coordinated a widespread wave of aggression against the Jews. The idea was to make it look like the general public was just fed up with the Jews and they were acting on it, when in fact orders from the top came down that the SS, SA, and even the Hitler Youth were to basically riot around Jewish communities. In the end, hundreds of synagogues were burned and vandalized, with countless Jewish-owned businesses and homes suffering the same fate. All the while, firefighters and police were instructed to stand aside and let it happen. Doubling down on the awful, the next day approximately 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to places like the Dachau concentration camp. The general point of it all seems to have been in line with simply trying to convince the Jews to leave the country in various brutal ways. On this one, those arrested whose families could show proof that they would be leaving the country soon seem to have been released without issue. On top of the extreme oppression of the Jewish people being common knowledge, the eventual euthanasia program against certain groups like the so-called feeble-minded was also well known once it was instituted. Illustrating both, we have the heroic tale of priest Bernhard Lichtenberg, who very publicly prayed for the Jews of the nation daily with his congregation, as well as openly protesting both their treatment and the Nazi euthanasia programs. Despite countless warnings that if he continued his very public denouncement of the Nazis and their actions, there would be severe consequences, he ignored this completely, and even in 1941 wrote a letter to the Minister of Public Health, Leonardo Conti, stating, "I, as a human being, a Christian, a priest, and a German, demand of you, Chief Physician of the Reich, that you answer for the crimes that have been perpetrated at your bidding and with your consent, and which will call forth the vengeance of the Lord on the heads of the German people." Unfortunately for Lichtenberg, very shortly after this, he was arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison. As for his sentencing, he requested that he be sent off with the Jews to the east in the hope that he could provide some comfort for them there, but this request was denied, and he was instead sent to the Dachau concentration camp, where he contracted pneumonia and died in 1943. But again, up to this point, it would seem everyone had a very good idea of what was happening to the Jews and political dissidents of the nation, given the Nazis weren't exactly being subtle about any of it. In fact, in 1938, Time magazine named Hitler Man of the Year precisely because of this. Now, contrary to what is sometimes inferred from this was not to honour him, but quite the opposite. They stated, "Lesser men of the year seemed small indeed beside the Führer. Germany's 700,000 Jews had been tortured physically, robbed of homes and properties, denied a chance to earn a living, chased off the streets. Now they are being held for ransom, a gangster trick through the ages." They ended their article on the decision to name Hitler the Man of the Year on the ominous note, "To those who watched the closing events of the year, it seemed more than probable that the man of 1938 may make 1939 a year to be remembered." Time certainly nailed that one. Again, it's important to emphasize here that while there were certainly a lot of brutal and unjust deaths happening up to this point, along with all the other injustices, the overall plan with regards to the Jews seems to have been to run them out of any German-occupied nation. Unfortunately for the Jewish people, despite everyone pretty much being well aware of this, not just Germans, but the world on the whole seemed to be bothered to do very little about this. And as we'll get into shortly, even when the opportunity was there to help in the way the Nazis wanted as well, namely sending the Jews off to other countries, quite literally almost every nation the world over collectively said, "Yeah, no thanks," even knowing what was going on in Germany at the time. Although perhaps this shouldn't be so much of a surprise, given that even today this collective not my problem attitude with regards to accepting persecuted refugees from troubled nations is still very much a relatively common thing the world over. But as for this specific case, not helping the matter was that rampant anti-Semitism was hardly unique to Germany at the time, and not just that, but the general support for eugenics programs in some form was likewise pretty widespread the world over. For example, around this time, eugenicists in the US and elsewhere in the world were performing forced sterilization of the poor, sick, criminals, prostitutes, as well as forced abortions of pregnant women of ill repute or seen as inferior based on certain traits. Even the likes of Teddy Roosevelt, arguably one of the greatest humans to ever human, was in support of eugenics. For him, however, it had nothing to do with race. In fact, he was also unabashedly outspoken against people who judge people based on their race. For example, after being widely vilified for inviting Booker T. Washington to have dinner with him at the White House, Roosevelt's response to the extreme outcry, which included death threats, was simply, "I shall have him to dine as often as I please." He also said, "The only wise and honourable and Christian thing to do is to treat each black man and each white man strictly on his merits as a man, giving him no more and no less than he shows himself worthy to have." However, on the flip side, he also stated, when it came to eugenics, "I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding, and when the evil nature of these people is sufficiently flagrant, this should be done. Criminals should be sterilized and feeble-minded persons forbidden from leaving offspring behind." This stance was also supported by such famed individuals as Winston Churchill, Margaret Sanger, H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, John Harvey Kellogg, and of course Adolf Hitler, among countless others. The eugenics movement was spurred on and given its name by Sir Francis Galton in 1883, inspired by Galton's half-cousin Charles Darwin's work. Over half a century later, leading up to World War II, things had evolved significantly all over the world on this front, such as famed Cornell professor and neurologist Foster Kennedy, even going so far as to write in 1942, "I'm in favour of euthanasia for those helpless ones who should never have been born. Nature's mistakes." He also stated that if a child reached the age of 5 and was still defective by societal views, that the defective has no future or hope of one, then I believe it is a merciful and kindly thing to relieve that defective, often tortured and convulsed, grotesque and absurd, useless and foolish and entirely undesirable, the agony of living. While the idea of murdering 5-year-olds didn't exactly catch on in the United States, in 1936 in the US, 31 of the then 48 states had various eugenics or forced sterilization laws. The Supreme Court even rang in 1927 in the case Buck and Bell concerning the forced sterilization of, to quote, "feeble-minded white women," ruling that it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for the imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kinds. Not unique to the US or Germany, most of the developed world had similar laws on the books with widespread support. That said, everyone did a collective, oh wait a minute, thanks to the revelation that the Nazis had taken these ideas and run with them to their extreme during World War II, and after the war, public support for eugenics all but disappeared thanks to its association with Nazi Germany. But in the era of Nazi Germany itself, quite a lot of the populace of the world thought eugenics programs were a smashing idea, and anti-Semitism was likewise pretty widespread. The Nazis simply took these two ideas to their extreme and also put them together. But as for the general public of Germany, in the days leading up to and including World War I, we can both say for sure that the German people were extremely well aware of the concentration camps, despite many interviewed after the war denying knowledge of even their very existence. Further, they were also to an extent aware of some of the things that went on in those early camps, though the death camp-style concentration camps were not yet a thing before the war. And finally, they were also aware of the extreme oppression of the Jews in Germany, as were pretty much all of the rest of the world. Going back to the Nazi plan to simply get the Jews to leave, as alluded to, a big problem with this plan was that other countries weren't exactly keen about taking in a large influx of Jewish immigrants. This was also in part why relatively few German Jews fled the country. As one German Jew, Victor Klemperer, would write in his diary of his own attempt to leave, "Meeting with the immigration advisor of the Jewish community, result less than 0. You really must get out. But we see no possibility." There was also another issue here, in that for most of these Jewish people, Germany was their home. Some were even veterans of World War I and had fought and had friends and family die for their country. The Nazis weren't Germany, and many still loved their country and hoped for change. As Klemperer would write in 1942, "I am German, and still waiting for the Germans to come back. They've gone to ground somewhere." Although ultimately he did despair, "No one can take my Germanness away from me, but my nationalism and patriotism are gone forever." Going back to the immigration problem, the United States, despite its surface level supposed "give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free" thing, and the extreme success the US once had with more open immigration policies being a boon to the country, at this point they had a hard limit of 153,744 immigrants annually. This, in turn, was divided by country, with an awful lot of entry requirements to qualify on top of that. These requirements were so strict that many quotas during this time weren't filled at all, despite massively more applicants than than that number. On top of that, despite news of the atrocities being committed against the Jews leading up to the war, the majority of the public opposed relaxing immigration guidelines or boosting the numbers to accommodate those desperately wanting out of Germany. Other countries more or less mimicked this general stance, with Britain even going further by taking steps to try and limit the number of German Jews who would be allowed to immigrate to Palestine, which was one place that was taking a relatively large number of Jewish immigrants compared to most states. That said, in 1938, Britain did agree to amend policy to take in 10,000 Jewish children, but made no special provisions for taking any Jewish adults outside of the already established normal immigration procedures. So the problem was, the Nazis wanted the Jews to leave, and this was part of their original master plan. Further, as a result of Nazi actions and new laws, many Jews desperately wanted to leave, but most couldn't, because they had nowhere to go. That said, even if genocide wasn't maybe the original plan, it wasn't as if the idea of mass murder wasn't occasionally being proposed, even quite publicly, by the Nazis in power. Perhaps most pertinent to the topic at hand, in a speech in January of 1939, Hitler even went so far as to predict it. "Today, I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." Apparently, the Nazis being the ones to cause a Second World War wasn't a problem, though we guess it should also be pointed out here that this was not the only time Hitler very publicly telegraphed his prediction of the Holocaust should another world war break out. Of course, even with all of the propaganda and anti-Semitism, hating a culture or race or the like is one thing, but getting people to go along with mass murder of them, including children, is quite another, let alone getting the German public to go along with the idea of another major war so soon after a devastating one like World War I, which again saw over 2 million Germans dead, among an awful lot of other horribleness during and in the aftermath. Needless to say, the Nazis had a lot of creative storytelling to do. As such, first the Nazis did their utmost to convince everyone that the German brass were all about peace, but also made it clear they had a responsibility to protect Germans and thus needed to take up arms in order to protect the peace. As things progressed, they further pushed hard for the fact that they needed to defend against supposedly aggressive Poland, who were, according to them, mistreating ethnic Germans in that country. And not only that, they stated Poland was being extremely aggressive against Germany itself, flagrantly attacking, even though it turns out the truth of several cited events of Polish aggressions against Germany were actually Nazi SS dressed as Polish soldiers. Perhaps the most famous of these attacks was on a German radio station the day before Hitler announced Germany would now retaliate because of these attacks, all as a defensive action. Once Germany actually invaded Poland, the German press were also instructed to not reference this as a war, nor even Germany invading Poland, but rather simply Germany repelling Polish attacks. They were further trying to ensure that it would be other nations, like Britain and France, who would be the ones to declare war first against Germany, which they did a couple of days later, and thus, once again, Germany was simply defending itself against other nations declaring war against them. As a discussion for the comments below, up to this point, would the Nazis and Hitler have been more or less able to get away with convincing Germans of all of this if they'd had the internet? On the one hand, more than ever, we all have access to hard and provable data. On the other hand, the spread of misinformation is perhaps greater than ever. I mean, let us know your thoughts. In any event, directly after Germany invaded Poland, the Nazi propaganda machine further inflamed the German people, citing nearly 60,000 ethnic Germans supposedly slaughtered by the Polish directly after. In truth, there was a mass slaughter of ethnic Germans in the country in response to the invasion, but the number was about 10 times smaller than the German media reported. Speaking of mass murder, while countless thousands of Jews were murdered either directly or via maltreatment prior to the more concerted implementation of the final solution, this more systematic mass murder didn't begin until around 1941, when decisions were likewise being made with regards to war with the Soviet Union, as we'll get to shortly. That said, when Poland was invaded, the Germans did round up thousands of Jewish Poles, along with a pretty amazingly large number of other Poles, and summarily shot them and threw them into mass graves. Around the same time, now finally having a place to put the rest of the Jews, they began deporting them to the newly invaded country and elsewhere as the Nazis spread across Europe. As to what the general public thought about these deportations, it was generally stated that the mass roundup of the Jewish people would simply see them resettled and used for labor purposes. As anti-Semitism was at its zenith, few seem to have had a huge problem with this. Although it should be noted again that publicly speaking out against all of this wasn't exactly a great way to make it so you didn't join them, so that no doubt also contributed to the lack of outcry. Of course, the Nazi brass were aware that the Labour Front story had some plot holes in it. You see, they were also unabashedly rounding up elderly and disabled Jews who were unlikely to be very helpful towards these ends. To get around the logical problem, the propaganda machine spun a tale that those unable to work, like the elderly, were being sent to residential communities where they would live out their days in peace. Once it was established in 1941, the brass publicising the existence of the Theresienstadt ghetto, which did, in fact, house a lot of elderly Jews, but conditions were intentionally made so bad that the populace would be sure to not take too long dying. In fact, over 30,000 of its residents are known to have died there, despite it not technically being a death camp. On top of that, what they didn't mention was that Theresienstadt eventually also served as a way station of sorts to the death camps. Speaking of Theresienstadt and the propaganda machine, in 1944, after hundreds of Danish Jews were deported there the year before, the Danish Red Cross and the International Red Cross were successfully able to convince the Nazis that they should be allowed to come inspect the ghetto to ensure its people were actually being treated well, contrary to what the world press were reporting concerning mass extermination and countless crimes against humanity at this point. Wanting to put their money where their mouths were, the SS finally agreed to such an inspection several months after the request was made, so they had a chance to pretty up the place first. As such, before allowing such an inspection, the Nazis accelerated the deportation of Jews stashed in Theresienstadt, sending thousands off to their deaths to reduce the population density. As for the remaining populace, they were put to work renovating everything, planting gardens, repainting homes, etc. If you look at pictures from the results of all of this, the place does appear to be quite nice, and the populace that were chosen to remain for the inspection looked healthy. Of course, once the Red Cross completed their inspections, normal operations resumed. That said, to further take advantage of the apparent great conditions there, around the time of the Red Cross visit, the SS themselves made a documentary of sorts of the beautified place, including showing residents of the ghetto attending concerts, playing sports, working in their gardens, and otherwise just having a gay old time. Of course, what they failed to mention was that in order to get this footage beyond, of course, the aforementioned beautifying of the place, they also had to coerce the populace into playing their roles, using everything from threats to food to get them to cooperate. That said, the problem with the video they made here was that the life of those in the ghetto was in many ways depicted as superior to that of many of the general populace back in Germany at the time. Naturally, from this, when the SS finally completed the film, they decided not to show it to anyone, it's thought because of this reason. This is not unlike a rather funny mix-up during the Cold War, in which Stalin allowed the Grapes of Wrath under the alternate name The Road to Wrath to be viewed by the Soviet populace to depict how bad things could get under capitalism. Except the whole thing kind of backfired in that the film depicts incredibly impoverished Americans as still able to afford cars, something many in the Soviet Union just didn't have, and thus the film was quickly pulled and subsequently banned. Going back to the ghettos and trying to paint a rosier picture, another thing the Nazis did tell people from looking too closely was to spread about the idea that the Jews were all disease-ridden. They even went so far as to post quarantine signs at the entrances of ghettos, which simultaneously helped keep people away, while also explaining all of the bodies. There was just widespread disease inside, which, to be fair, thanks to the abhorrent conditions, sometimes was actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Going back to shortly after the invasion of Poland and other countries soon after, while again there certainly were an awful lot of deaths and atrocities happening, the concerted effort to systematically annihilate the Jews and various others as a central policy still wasn't yet a thing. This all changed, however, in 1941, when the final solution was agreed upon, initially via use of mass firing squads. Kicking things off in the most brutal way imaginable, we have the Kiev and Babi Yar ravine, where over 30,000 Jewish people were shot and killed in a 2-day span on September the 29th and 30th of that year. Noteworthy, upwards of 100,000 more people were also killed and dumped in the ravine as well at various points of German occupation. The original Grisly Act was described by the commander-in-charge, stating, "The difficulties resulting from such a large-scale action, in particular concerning the seizure, were overcome in Kiev by requesting the Jewish population through wall posters to move. Although only a participation of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 Jews had been expected at first, more than 30,000 Jews arrived who, until the very moment of their execution, still believed in their resettlement thanks to an extremely clever organization." A truck driver who witnessed what happened next described the gut-wrenching atrocity. "I watched what happened when the Jews, men, women, and children arrived. They led them past a number of different places where, one after the other, they had to give up their luggage, then their coats, shoes, and overgarments, and also underwear. They also had to leave their valuables in a designated place. There was a special pile for each article of clothing. It all happened very quickly, and anyone who hesitated was kicked or pushed to keep them moving." After that, once they undressed, they were led into the ravine, which was about 150 meters long and 30 meters wide and a good 15 meters deep. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they were seized by members of the Schutzpolizei and made to lie down on top of Jews who had already been shot. The corpses were literally in layers. A police marksman came along and shot each Jew in the neck with a submachine gun. I saw these marksmen stand on layers of corpses and shoot one after the other. The marksman would walk across the bodies of the executed Jews to the next Jew, who had meanwhile lain down and shot him. Of the well over 30,000 Jews that were victims of this insanity, only 29 survived. One such, Dina Pronicheva, stated she jumped onto the bodies before being shot, then played dead while the Nazis shot at those still alive around her. Once nightfall came, they had covered many of the bodies with dirt, but there were still SS walking around shooting anyone they found alive. However, it was dark, and when an opportune moment came, she was able to crawl out from among the bodies and sneak away without being seen. Another interesting thing to point out is that the decision to start the systematic mass annihilation of the Jews followed almost immediately after the United States entered the war, thus making it a so-called world war, with Nazi politician and Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels stating, regarding the Jewish question, the Führer warned the Jews that if they were to cause another world war, it would lead to their destruction. Those were not empty words. Now the world war has come. The destruction of the Jews must be its necessary consequence. We cannot be sentimental about it. Now, finally, having begun the open genocide, plans began in earnest to convert some of the concentration camps to also include designated facilities for rapid mass executions, as it was noted that the mass firing squad method was bad for troop morale and also rather inefficient on the scale they needed, as well as it wasted an awful lot of bullets. And as to that scale, from March 1942 to November 1943 alone, some 1.5 million Jews were murdered in just 3 concentration camps via gas chamber. So, what did people know about this escalation of atrocities? Almost immediately after these mass murders began, the Allies caught wind of it. Not only reports from the likes of frankly amazing heroes like Poletsky, the Allies also were, among many other sources, intercepting transmissions from the Germans about all manner of mass killings. Churchill summed up the gathered intelligence in a live broadcast in 1941, quote, "As Hitler's armies advance, whole districts are being exterminated. Scores of thousands, literally scores of thousands of executions in cold blood are being perpetrated by the German police troops. Since the Mongol invasions of Europe in the 16th century, there has never been methodical, merciless butchery on such a scale or approaching such a scale. And this is but the beginning. Famine and pestilence have yet to follow in the bloody ruts of Hitler's tanks. We are in the presence of a crime without a name." Outside of such speeches as this, there are literally thousands upon thousands of known news reports in the Allied world discussing these atrocities in surprisingly accurate detail in some cases, with headlines like from the London Times, "Massacre of Jews, over 1 million dead since war began," or the Montreal Daily Star with the article, "Nazi Slaughterhouse, Germans Massacre Million Jews in Extermination Drive." Edward Murrow of CBS Radio on December the 13th, 1942, reported very frankly, "What is happening is this. Millions of human beings, most of them Jews, are being gathered up with ruthless efficiency and murdered. The phrase concentration camps is obsolete, as out of date as economic sanctions or non-recognition. It is now possible only to speak of extermination camps." Summing it up with remarkable accuracy, in late 1942, the US, Soviet Union, and Britain all released a joint statement that read, "Jews are being transported in conditions of appalling horror and brutality to Eastern Europe. In Poland, which has been made the principal Nazi slaughterhouse, the ghettos established by the German invaders are being systematically emptied of all Jews except a few highly skilled workers required for war industries. None of those taken away are ever heard of again. The able-bodied are slowly worked to death in labour camps. The infirm are left to die of exposure and starvation, or are deliberately massacred in mass executions. The number of victims of these bloody cruelties is reckoned in many hundreds of thousands of entirely innocent men, women, and children." Needless to say, the Allied world was well aware of what was happening. That said, it should be noted that World War I propaganda reports by Allied brass included an awful lot of atrocities that turned out to be exaggerated or not true at all after the fact, so people, even in Allied lands, were initially skeptical despite the evidence and reports that were presented. Going back to Germany, the tightly controlled German media were unsurprisingly prevented from discussing the various massacres so openly, with the Nazi Party themselves largely both denying all of this, and with regards to the Jews, denying the poor living conditions within ghettos and concentration camps as previously previously noted. That said, given the German media and Nazi brass seemed to often feel the need to counter rumours publicly, it would at least seem the case that the rumours were out there fairly prominently. On that note, listening to illegal broadcasts from Allied sources within Germany and German-controlled regions was a thing, as were at times reading dropped Allied leaflets and the like. Not just that, it's pointed out by history professor Dr. Connell Feigs that exterminating that many people wasn't exactly something that could be done without an insane amount of support staff on various levels knowing about it, stating, "The task was so enormous, complex, time-consuming, and mentally and economically demanding that it took the best efforts of millions of Germans. All spheres of life in Germany actively participated. Businessmen, policemen, bankers, doctors, lawyers, soldiers, railroad and factory workers, chemists, pharmacists, foremen, production managers, economists, manufacturers, jewelers, diplomats, civil servants, propagandists, filmmakers and film stars, professors, teachers, politicians, mayors, party members, construction experts, art dealers, architects, landlords, janitors, truck drivers, clerks, industrialists, scientists, generals, and even shopkeepers. All were essentially cogs in the machinery that accomplished the final solution." Going back to illegal broadcasts, as the war progressed and Germany began to suffer some rather catastrophic defeats, the Nazis began to have a much more difficult time satisfactorily explaining away events to favour Germany. And, for example, after the Germans were trounced in Stalingrad in February 1943, the dissonance between official news stories and what was being reported by the German media seemed to result in more and more Germans beginning to reject the state propaganda and turn to foreign radio broadcasts instead in order to learn what was really going on. Foreign broadcasts, again, that were quite openly discussing the countless atrocities. That said, as was happening to an extent in Allied lands, even among the German populace who were listening to the broadcast and otherwise heard the seemingly pretty rampant rumours about all of this, there seems to have been a great deal of scepticism. After all, it's not like the German people were stupid when it came to their own government's propaganda machine. It would seem many were well aware that they were being fed lies on a number of fronts from the Nazis. So it was, thus, not a stretch that the other side might come up with their own set of lies, making the Nazis and Germany out to be committing unspeakable acts. This sort of propaganda, again, wasn't that uncommon on both sides in the last World War, which was still relatively fresh on everybody's minds. That said, from various journal entries and the like, we do at least know some Germans who weren't directly involved were convinced, though they were powerless to do anything about it. For example, we have the case of one Friedrich Kellner, a staunch and, in the early days at least, very publicly outspoken opponent of the Nazi Party, which got him on the brutal end of more than one beating. As events progressed, he finally accepted there was nothing much he could, from a practical standpoint, do about any of it. Although he still wasn't exactly quiet about the things he found out, ultimately making him a target of the Nazis, with one Nazi official, Ernst Monig, writing a report about Kellner's actions which read, "He should be made to disappear." Nevertheless, Kellner was not killed, and instead wrote, "I could not fight the Nazis in the present, as they had the power to still my voice, so I decided to fight them in the future." Thus, he took to doing his best to document the Nazi atrocities and methods of getting the public to support them or otherwise allow things to happen. The summation of his work was in the form of his journal titled My Opposition. Noteworthy to the discussion at hand, many historians who advocate that the German populace knew a lot more than seemed to be the case after the war point out that much of Kellner's information came from publicly available sources such as Nazi broadcasts, hundreds of newspaper clippings, and talking to various community members around him, as well as listening to illegal Allied broadcasts and the like. Basically, there was nothing much special about Kellner or the information he had access to. On this note, Kellner had some rather harsh words for his fellow Germans, stating, "There is no punishment that would be hard enough to be applied to these Nazi beasts. Of course, when the retribution comes, the innocent will have to suffer along with them. But because 99% of the German population is guilty, directly or indirectly, for the present situation, we can only say that those who travel together will hang together." Of the atrocities committed he was aware of, these included the so-called mercy killings of various Germans, as well as countless mass murders against civilians, both domestically and abroad in occupied territories. For example, he documented the execution of about 100 French civilians in retaliation for 2 German officers being killed, stating, "To let people who are completely innocent suffer for the deeds of another is reminiscent of the horrific deeds of wild beasts in times long ago." As for the slaughter of Jews, he states, among other evidence he collected, a soldier on leave here said he personally witnessed a terrible atrocity in the occupied part of Poland. He watched as naked Jewish men and women were placed in front of a long, deep ditch, and upon the order of the SS, were shot by Ukrainians in the back of their heads, and they fell into the ditch. Then the ditch was filled in as screams kept coming from it. He also elaborates this cruel, despicable, and sadistic treatment against the Jews that has lasted now several years, with its final goal of extermination, is the biggest stain on the honour of Germany. They will never be able to erase these crimes. Noteworthy here is that he was already documenting these atrocities in 1941, before the more mass implementation of the so-called final solution. To help spread the word beyond openly discussing these things with those around, he would also rather bravely do things like gathering dropped Allied leaflets and placing them around his town so the maximum number of people would be exposed to them. That said, while he was more or less an average German citizen, he was one who actively sought information about what the Nazis were up to from any source that he could find, piecing together everything from there to try and discern the truth. So what about everyone else? Again, historians are in disagreement as to the extent of the wider public's knowledge about what was going on. This is despite countless surviving journals showing that at least some people were very aware, or at least suspected, what was going on, not to mention the innumerable number of people directly involved on some level and their relations. Not to mention, again, people seeming to have had at least some level of access to the needed information. So what about the other side of the argument? On the side that it maybe wasn't totally common knowledge, besides many after the fact claiming that they didn't know, we have that it appears many of the Jews rounded up weren't under the impression they would be taken off to death camps or the like. The general perception seems to be that they knew they were going into a really bad situation with the very real possibility of dying, but that they didn't think they were being mass murdered, just extremely mistreated. The Nazi regime helped foster this notion in a variety of ways. For example, in 1941, a booklet printed by the Nazi brass for widespread consumption outlined how Jews in places like Poland had been given work, access to hospitals, food, and those who needed it even provided with vocational training. More directly, they reassured the Jews rounded up and in the ghettos that the deported from these points were being sent to places with better conditions. To help corroborate this, upon arrival into the concentration camps, many inmates were forced to write letters about the good condition in the camps. On this note, even in the ghettos themselves, there seems to have been a lot of skepticism about the final solution. The issue primarily seems to just go back to, once again, despite all the evidence slapping everybody in the face, many just refused to believe their fellow human beings could actually be doing this, and it wasn't just some sort of propaganda campaign from the other side. As one of the leaders of the Jewish resistance in Warsaw, Yitzhak Zuckerman, noted, common sense could not understand that it was possible to exterminate tens and hundreds of thousands of Jews. Of course, as Allied troops began liberating countries and their concentration camps as they marched toward Germany, things eventually changed. But before it did, the Allied soldiers almost universally would later write of their exasperation at the apparent widespread accounts from Germans themselves that they had been totally ignorant of any of these atrocities. For example, William Ward of the 232nd Infantry stated all of the locals were adamant that they were nicht Nazi and didn't have any idea what had taken place at the concentration camp. Another by the name of Arthur Johnson stated all these people who claimed they didn't know anything about it, and they were just 10 or 15 miles from Weimar, Buchenwald concentration camp. Noteworthy on this one, to counter previous Allied reports about atrocities there, Nazi propaganda had stated all the bodies were from mass burial of air raid victims. In this case, both showing a plausible alternate story, as well as also demonstrating that the news was out there for the German public to the extent that the Nazis felt like they needed to address the topic. In the end, while the matter is still hotly contested, the general consensus is that it is clear a considerable number of people beyond those directly involved did have access to the needed information to know what was going on. But not just largely apparently unwilling to believe it, even when directly told after the war, resistance to the idea seems to have still been a thing throughout the world, at least at first. In short, for a world on both sides used to pretty rampant and often blatantly false propaganda, when it came to World War I and a German populace quite familiar with a whole lot of BS coming from their own government on the propaganda front, it was perhaps difficult to know what to believe, especially when the atrocities were so insane in their reported degree. On top of this, for many Germans peripherally complicit in these acts and under Nazi rule with little else they could do about it, many perhaps simply didn't want to believe that it was true, even when exposed to the necessary information. As one contemporary German housewife noted, of course, there were rumours about the camps, but no one believed them. We thought that the prisoners might be working hard, that they might not be getting plenty of good food, and we even imagined some beatings or making the prisoners shout in chorus, Heil Hitler. Of course, once direct evidence in the form of pictures and videos and survivor accounts and the like flooded the newsways the world over, skeptics throughout the world, for the most part, finally came to accept the truth.